Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Dudley with the New Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Impacts of Senate Bill 596 and Other Low Carbon Policy Initiatives in California. Thank you for joining us. Attendees today are in listen-only mode, and because we're recording today's webinar, we'll be taking any questions via email at info@newconcrete.org. The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New Center, ACI, or its committees. As with all concrete mixtures, trial batches should be performed to verify concrete properties. Results may vary due to the variety of circumstances, including temperature and mixture components, among other things. You should consult your materials, cement, and concrete professionals for design assistance. Nothing contained herein shall be considered or construed as a warranty or guarantee, either expressed or implied, including any warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. An abstract of today's webinar is shown on the screen and is also listed on the new website with the webinar series information. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Tom Tietz is the Executive Director of the California Nevada Cement Association. In this role, Tom is involved with oversees CNCA's regulatory and legislative efforts that focus on infrastructure and the environment. He also is actively engaged in the association's mission to be an established technical resource in the region. Tom's career started in architecture after receiving a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Arts degree in architecture from the University of Illinois and practicing as a licensed architect. Tom has been working for trade associations since the mid-90s. These associations include CNCA and the Concrete Reinforcing Steel Institute. He has provided seminar topics to agencies, architects, engineers, contractors, and universities across the United States. And now I'll hand the presentation off to Tom to get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good morning. I certainly appreciate this opportunity and look forward to explaining what's happening in California. And as mentioned earlier, there'll be a chance to submit questions afterward. But what I'd like to do is paint a pretty big picture today. We won't be getting into a lot of technical details. We do that in other presentations that we provide. But you will get an overview of where we're heading in terms of carbon reduction for the cement industry, for the concrete industry. And I hope this is enlightening. I certainly enjoyed this opportunity when I was at the ACI conference in San Francisco. But just to give you a little insight as to what California is looking toward in the future, in 2006, California passed AB 32, which required the state to be at by 2020 to be at 1990 levels of CO2 emissions. In 2030, we're required to be 40% below 1990 levels, and then to reach essentially carbon neutrality and net negativity after 2045. And the cement industry has been a key part of the cap and trade program here in California. And you can see on this slide, we work very closely with the California Air Resources Board in terms of very closely not only monitoring our emissions, but projecting and enforcing reductions in our emissions. And in the state of California, you can see here on this graphic that while the industrial sector makes up about 20% of the emissions in the state of California, the cement industry is right around 2%. That's larger than the percentage nationally, which is closer to 1%. But that 2% comes from the 7 cement plants in California, and we are on that same trajectory to hit carbon neutrality by 2045. And our industry is committed to this. We wanted to mention that we have a carbon neutrality plan that we came out with 2 years ago, which we're about to reissue with updates this coming month in July here, right around the flip of the calendar. And we're pretty excited about how we're seeing progress in certain areas, and we've identified new opportunities. And I'll describe what that carbon neutrality plan includes. It includes this one bold goal of reaching carbon neutrality by the end of 2045. And what we recognize is that this is a commitment that's one of these all of the above approaches. You'll see the 8 levers in this plan, but we believe all of them are important to really unlock that pathway to make this happen. It is extraordinarily difficult to do this. And we also recognize that we need close coordination among stakeholders throughout the value chain. And this doesn't just include industry, but it includes owners, developers, and engineers and architects. I'm pretty sure we've got a few of those in the virtual room here today. And we've got a very high priority of dealing specifically with stakeholders through the public policy ecosystem. That's legislators, regulators, and other stakeholders. Now I'm going to show you a couple of slides which may seem very basic, but it gets to how we're approaching carbon neutrality. I'm guessing most of the folks in the audience this morning understand how cement is produced and that we have a necessary thermal process, which really comes from 2 sources. The emissions that come from cement production include both process emissions and fuel emissions. And it's really that 61%, that big blue part of the circle on the right here, that is the most difficult to abate. And as you probably already know, the limestone that comes into the kiln that you see here on the screen here on the left-hand side and finds its way down, goes through a calcining process, which naturally reduces CO2 when you are putting limestone into a place where you're basically melting it and changing its chemical composition. So our plan looks at both process emissions and fuel emissions with specific strategies and goals. And this is what it looks like. We have 3 pathways and 8 levers. The process emissions are really addressed through these first 3 levers. The first of which is blended cements. This is the lever that if you're an engineer, you can reach for and start pulling on now. All of the other levers, 2 through 8, really have to do with the way cement is produced within the footprint of a specific plant. But as you can see here, we've identified levers such as carbon capture, use and storage, alternative cements and clinkers, all as part of process emissions. For combustion emissions, we've identified renewable natural gas, various types of alternative fuels, and on-site electricity generation is another area that we think is vital for reaching these goals. So as you can see in these first 2 columns, we recognize the need for legislative assistance in 6 of these 8 levers and for regulatory assistance in 7 of these 8 levers. And knowing that cement is the largest impact for CO2 in concrete, we recognize that this matters not just for our industry, but for the entire concrete industry. And this is why we spend so much time focusing on the legislative and regulatory part of each of these endeavors. And we also have public acceptance, public funding, research, design, and development, and supply limitations that all come into play for various parts. We also recognize that these various levers have different timeframes. And the timing is important because reaching this goal of 40% reductions by 2035 per the Senate bill I'll be mentioning, and net zero by 2045 really puts pressure on us to start making a difference. And I'll mention one of those, carbon capture, use and storage. Just talking to one of our member companies recently, they anticipate an 8-year process to install a full carbon capture system at a plant. That time frame really needs to be sped up and accelerated for us to start meeting some of these goals. But we'll talk about a couple examples here. I won't get into all 8 of these, but I'll show you what a few of these look like in terms of how we're doing this. So pathway number 1 is reducing process emissions, as I mentioned. It is the most significant constraint on abating emissions for our industry because of this natural byproduct in the process. So one example of a product that is becoming more and more familiar, not only in California, but beyond, is Portland limestone cement. I feel here that the California story is important because so many states in the West look to Caltrans for approval. And this doesn't just go for DOTs. Caltrans approval is looked to throughout the industry here as something very important. But nationally, we know that all the major barriers are removed, from AIA to government work throughout the Defense Department, ACI, ICC building codes include PLC. Caltrans was the 38th state to approve Portland limestone cement, but only after a 3-year study at Oregon State University, where they really wanted to dive into the impacts of California-specific materials. And I thought I'd throw this slide in, which I didn't have when I presented this in San Francisco, but this shows just the dramatic change that's happening throughout the country in terms of the share of blended cement used today. And that's rapidly increasing and will continue to do so. Another lever related to process emissions is carbon capture. Here, we recognize that technologies are still in the early stages. There's only a handful of projects underway globally at the moment, and it also requires quite a bit of energy and cost. So this is one of the areas that we feel like it's very important to work with state government, particularly in a market like ours, which is exposed to imports as well. So if cement plants are making investments as deep as these are for carbon capture projects in California, our companies need to be assured that it's not risky investment. So we also recognize beyond the cost impacts that there are significant permitting delays that typically impact projects of this size. So those are some of the things that we're looking for, really pushing forward with that particular technology. Also, pathway number 2 looks at fuel switching. One of the things that we are looking at are just different types of fuel to be used in cement kilns, much like we see in other parts of the world. So here you can see that the emissions intensity of other products other than coal can be helping us reduce emissions in this area. And one thing I think is interesting is that it's really the amount of these alternative fuels that we'd like to see increased. For instance, the EU, I understand, is up over 60% now in terms of the use of alternative fuels. The United States is at 16%, and California is still under 10%. So we've got a ways to go in this area as well. And then I'll mention on-site electricity generation. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, Cal Portland has a significant wind farm at their Mojave, California cement plant. And we're also looking very closely at waste heat recovery. We recognize that about 1/3 of the cement plants in the world utilize waste heat recovery. California has a notoriously unstable grid and very expensive electricity. So we think this is the time to explore that possibility here as well. And now I'll mention Senate Bill 596. I outlined the pathways that we see for getting to carbon neutrality. Shortly after that report that was completed in 2021 came out, we worked very closely with Senator Josh Becker out of the Bay Area to work on this bill, along with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And the reason we think this is important goes right back to that slide earlier, where we see the need for legislative and regulatory assistance to hit these very aggressive goals. So this was a landmark bill, not just for our industry, but also for the state of California. It was the first bill in any California sector to focus on achieving net zero emissions. And what I'll do, I'll just show you 2 slides, which give you an example of some of the text within that bill. Here's a couple excerpts, and I'll just read these. Senate Bill 596 recognizes that there are a wide range of commercially available technologies and practice that exist to reduce and remove emissions of greenhouse gases throughout the life cycle of cement and concrete production and use. But these technologies and practice practices face a series of market and regulatory barriers hindering their deployment. So they're recognizing these barriers. And here's how we feel like Senate Bill 596 can help accelerate the progress that we need. In this case, it says the state board shall document the feasibility constraints and recommend measures and actions, including proposed statutory changes necessary to overcome those constraints to enable the cement sector to achieve net zero emissions of greenhouse gases as soon as possible, but no later than 2045. That's where we need to start moving faster. So I just gave you an overview of Senate Bill 596 and how the California cement industry is really striving and pushing aggressively towards this goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. Part of this presentation is also about additional state and local actions. And I recognize this is a national presentation, so there are likely folks from outside of California and Nevada in attendance. And this is one source that I think you'll find helpful. In my mind, the Carbon Leadership Forum has the best website for not only understanding through their policy toolkit how various low carbon concrete initiatives are happening, but where they're happening as well. So if you go to this website from the Carbon Leadership Forum, you'll find this map, and you can click on these various pins to find out what's going on. You can see here in California, there's 15, 16, 17. There's lots of initiatives happening in this state, and I'll talk about a few of them. So one thing that did happen here in 2017 is that California enacted the Buy Clean California Act. That bill was passed in 2017 and put into action last year, and it provides carbon limits or global warming potential limits for structural steel, rebar, flat glass, and mineral board insulation. And this has oftentimes been looked to as a model for actions that have happened since 2017 around the country. Additional statewide actions that have occurred here, a bill passed last year in 2022 requiring the California Air Resources Board to include a strategy to achieve 20% net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by 2030 and a 40% reduction no later than 2035. That aligns with the trajectory of the first part of Senate Bill 596 that I shared earlier, but applies to other building materials. Also happening in California, we have a new codes proposal. So this isn't just related to legislation, but also the building code. We have a green code here called Cal Green, and the new codes proposal that would be enacted next year, assuming everything gets approved, would also include mandatory reductions for maximum global warming potential levels in various concrete mix designs disclosed by project-specific EPDs. Also included will be a voluntary provision for a whole building life cycle assessment to reach target requirements. So those are developments underway on the codes front. I also wanted to mention that Caltrans is involved in this too. So it's not just the buildings market, but also infrastructure. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see a roadmap that Caltrans has put together related to collection of environmental product declarations for both concrete and asphalt, establishing global warming limits, producing a life cycle assessment tool. And in addition to that, you see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a current bill in the assembly here in California that would apply additional pressure for Caltrans to make these things real. Next thing I want to mention is that this is happening not just at the state level, but at the local level, and even right down to the project level. I like throwing in this slide on the left. There's an example of a project at University of California, San Diego, with some beautiful Portland limestone cement concrete. But to the middle part of my screen, we're seeing this happen in terms of carbon limits for private buildings and public infrastructure for state procurements, and it will be impacting all of us through the federal GSA. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides are examples of private buildings and public infrastructure where they're looking at global warming potential limits that are below the NRMCA national average. So I highlighted just one as an example. If you take a look at NRMCA's regional average for 4,000 PSI concrete, you see a global warming potential equivalent, or global warming CO2 equivalent of 360. Keep that number in mind as you look at the next couple slides. Here's the Marin County Low Carbon Concrete Code. This is significant not just for Marin County, which is just north of the bay from San Francisco, but has been really used as a model for efforts around the country, not just here in California. And in this case, you see two ways of measuring the global warming potential for concrete in this program. And in this case, you can either have a limit on the amount of cement in your mix in that middle column, or if you have an environmental product declaration, you can then be required to meet these limits of global warming potential. So if you look here, the 360 was the number for the regional average. This particular program is looking at 313 for a 4,000 PSI mix. And you can see those numbers for other strengths as well. And then here's just a couple other examples of projects. This is a private office building and parking garage in San Diego. In this case, you see the 4,000 PSI. They're looking to get all the way down to 267 in terms of global warming potential. Another example here, down to 250 kilograms per CO2 equivalents for the city of San Jose, 88 ramps. The Capitol Annex in Sacramento, they actually take different applications of the concrete project here in terms of where the concrete will be used and their strengths, and include a variety of global warming potential maximums for those mixed designs. So these are examples of things that we're seeing locally. And in summary, I want to make sure that I've communicated a few things this morning. Number one, decarbonizing cement production is very essential in meeting aggressive global warming potential reduction goals, not just for cement, but also for concrete. We hear numbers, whether it's 85 or 90% of concrete's CO2 impact coming from cement. We really believe that supporting our initiatives here in California and PCA's roadmap to carbon neutrality, all of those levers are essential and important, and not just one, all of them are important, as I mentioned earlier, for achieving these goals. And I also want to mention that specifically here in California, we are very committed to working with others. That includes policymakers right in the Capitol, where I spent time this week, regulators, developers, engineers, architects, advocates, and others to advance solutions to remove these barriers that are so essential for us to achieve the aggressive provisions of Senate Bill 596. And lastly, I would really encourage everyone listening today to get involved. I've heard folks, particularly from the cement and concrete industry, occasionally complain about the way certain things go. My admonition there is to be involved. Get involved and understand what's happening so that your voice is heard and you can be part of the solution. That's my strong recommendation. I appreciate this opportunity, and now I will pass it back over to New.
Thank you so much, Tom. Please visit the new website at newconcrete.org for more information on this topic. And while you're there, please check out our resources on lower carbon concrete production and placement. The website provides access to our sustainable concrete guides, frequently asked questions, webinar recordings, and more. Again, we're happy to answer any questions you may have about today's webinar at info@newconcrete.org. And thank you for attending today's webinar. We please stay tuned for future new webinars. Thank you again.